Hi everyone, I hope you're all well. It's Bank Holiday Monday here in the UK and we are basking in the most glorious weather. Usually bank holidays mean that it's going to be chucking it down with rain. You maybe go to the cinema, go out shopping and get absolutely soaked, or spend the long weekend at home. And lots of people are going to be lighting barbecues and such today because it's going to hit 26 degrees here. It's going to hit 28 degrees. Um, that's centigrade, by the way, in case you didn't, in case you were thinking I meant Fahrenheit. It's meant to hit maybe tops of 28 in other parts of south of England today, but here it's going to hit 26. But I've woken up earlier this morning and I finished off this wonderful book, and I absolutely loved it and I want to talk about it. So my plan is later on I might sit in the garden for a while with my next book, which I'll be announcing in my separate video as usual. But anyway, enough about that. Let's talk about this book, and that is Tony Robinson's autobiography, No Cunning Plan, My Story. So this follows Tony talking about his life and his career all the way through up to 2013. He begins his prologue in 2013 when he's knighted, and he ends the book with the epilogue when he married his now wife Louise in 2013, as well as attended a couple of funerals of people who he was very close to, which were very sad to read. It was a very interesting way to end the book, because various things had happened to him, and to have the beginning of the epilogue be so up on a high with his wedding, and then to bring it down again with these funerals, it was quite a solemn way of ending his book. But it's life, it's what it is, and he talks about that in various other chapters in his book. But anyway, enough about the solemn ending. What did I love about this book? I loved that with this book, Tony was always himself. I'd loved Tony Robinson since I was first introduced to him via Blackadder when I was a teenager, thanks to my dad, because he loved Blackadder, Fawlty Towers, all those, Porridge, all those classic comedies. And so me and my sister kind of were brought up on them. And then I got really into history, as did my sister, and Time Team happened to hit when it started in 1990, but there was various other, as it went along, as I kind of grew up, I got really caught up in the show, and I absolutely loved it, and I watched pretty much all of them. I then watched all of his various documentaries, like The Worst Jobs in History, the Real. It was a series that it began with The Real, and then each episode was like The Real Robin Hood, The Real Richard III, and such. So you had every week the title was slightly different. I'd kind of grown up with Tony Robinson in my life, but I didn't really know much about him until I read this book. I knew him as a TV personality, not as the person. And I saw him at the Cheltenham Literature Festival promoting this book, and I also saw him, I think, the year before, talking about archaeology and Time Team. And what I love about Tony, and it comes across in his various interviews that he does, and various other things that I've seen him in, kind of behind the scenes stuff of TV shows that he's been a part of, and in his documentaries, is that when he talks about something that he's really passionate about, he gets really enthusiastic and really wants to talk about various different aspects of it. He's not like Stephen Fry, who, for example, in his autobiographies, which the first two of which that I've read and reviewed here, he very much likes to tell you the history of things. So say, for example, his school. Stephen Fry will tell you all the history of the school, when it was established, or all that lot, when sections of it were built, etc. And then he'll start talking about his school life. Whereas Tony, he's like, yeah, I turned up at school, I was, this age, I thought it was crap. I didn't like the teachers. That was it. He very much tells you how he felt when at that time about the situations he was in and such. He doesn't take his time to talk about the history of something unless it was vitally important for you to know, to understand related chapters. The things that he does this, for example, is when he's talking about the union, the actors union, and politics, because politics has been very important in his life. He's part of his Labour Party, and he was involved a lot with campaigning and such, which he talks about a lot in this, and being part of actors unions and being young and gung-ho and wanted to make a difference and such, and then how, as he went through the various different stages of his life, how he felt about it, as an older person looking back, and how proud he is of what he did. And he's still, to this day, very, very passionate about politics, and it really comes across in this book. I also loved how his camaraderie with others. Because he was an actor, right? Because I didn't know his theatre stuff. I didn't know about his directing plays. I didn't really know anything about him. I didn't know how even though I adore theatre, how theatre as plays are developed, how a director works, what the actors need from the director, what it's like ad-libbing, what it's like being told, okay, let's have a discussion about this, what it's like being told, no, you're just literally going to read the lines on the script and do nothing else. How frustrating it can be, how liberating it can be, how terrifying it can be, and how that was such a thrill for him. So it really opened my eyes to the various areas of acting, and you can really feel his enjoyment and his passion on the page. I really, really now want to get the audiobook of this, because I really love it when the actual author is reading their works. One of the best audiobooks for this that I've come across in it was last year, it was June last year, was when I read Bruce Springsteen's autobiography. My dad had the audiobook on CD, and he lent it to me so I could listen to it, and I just fell in love with it. And I loved how Bruce, when he was talking about certain things like musical acts when he was younger, his voice would suddenly become really bouncy and excited, and almost like he wanted to explode with all of these words, and he was talk faster and get really wound up and excited. When there was really serious stuff, his tone would drop and he would become the very businessman side of him would come out. And then when you had really dark parts of his and very, very tragic parts of his life come to play, you could feel him kind of trembling and trying to pull back tears, and his voice quivers and such. And I love that, because the connection with the reader is on a completely different level than just words on a page. And I could feel in reading this certain various passages, I could hear Tony's voice, I could hear his excitement, I could hear his kind of a more serious dark side, and I could really hear his sadness, especially in the epilogue. But I was moved to tears by this book, especially with the death of his parents due to dementia. It took his mother many years before she passed away, and his dad only 3 months after he was diagnosed. So I really felt it, especially because with my grandmother, who died a couple of years ago, the same kind of things like that my dad told me that my nana was doing when she was in hospital was the exact same as his dad, and he was utterly confused and didn't understand what was going on and how to help his dad. And it really got to me because of that connection. I couldn't help but think about my nana and what my dad went through with dealing with that and trying to look after he was trying to look after my granddad at the same time, and the confusion that it blew up in our family. That was a really hard chapter, and I cried my eyes out when I read that. But one thing I have to say I really love about Tony in this book was how fun he was, and I loved like the house commune that he set up with his friends, and how they'd have these wonderful parties with various writers and everything. How he really likes people around him. He likes to immerse himself in stories, and I really loved also the people that came across his life. Sometimes you get people like Tony Robinson and Stephen Fry and such, and all of these big names start falling into their books, and you're like, oh my god, and and they just kind of just casually say their names. It's like da da da. And Tony occasionally does this, where he's just saying, "Oh, I worked with this on this play, and XYZ was in it," and so you're like, "Oh my god, okay." But then when it's somebody who he's known since he was young, he really builds up the picture of them. You really get to know them personally, and then in like the last sentence, he tells you who they are, and it's like, wow. And my favourite one is a man who he worked with. He was doing backstage work, and every time something went wrong, he and the other students would go, "Oh, Cameron," and he wore like these crazy jumpers with holes in the elbows, and it was a running joke that whenever something went wrong, everyone went, "Oh, Cameron," and they laugh off of it. And then he said, years later, I bumped into Cameron at a West End show party, and he was in a smart suit and everything. I hadn't seen him for years, and we said, "Oh, how are you doing?" And I said, "Are you working backstage on the show?" And he said, "No, I own the show." And then he just has like his throwaway line, and he refers to him as Cameron McIntosh. And obviously Cameron McIntosh is the greatest producer of West End musicals ever, and I was practically squealing when when I read it was Cameron McIntosh. I love that he does things like that. He allows you to. He's not just name dropping because he's like, "Oh yes, I knew that person." Oh yeah. He's getting you to know them as he knew them, and then revealing who they are at the end of the passages. It's absolutely wonderful. I want to read a section from one of the chapters. It's nearer the end of the book, but I loved that it shows kind of how Tony feels about camaraderie and wanting to make sure that everyone has a good time, basically, in anything that he does, and he likes it when he really gets along with people who he's working with. Okay, this is from it's near the end of the book, but it was a bit that I absolutely loved, and so I wanted to read it out to you. So here we go. It's from chapter 26, just so you know. It's the chapter called The Confused Mum. Apart from my work on the NEC, my time was divided between looking after my poorly mum, immersing myself in horrible jobs, and digging holes in people's back gardens. Sorry, I've got to say, during this chapter, he's running back and forth between the programme Time Team being filmed, his documentary series, The Worst Jobs in History, and looking after his mum. So he's actually doing a morning in one and an afternoon in another, and then going home to see his mum and flipping back and forth between the three all day, every day. Okay. It was extraordinary that Time Team was still firing up on all cylinders after so long. We had rows, mostly about the conflicting demands of television and archaeology, but someone involved looked forward to the digs. The excavations had become more complex. Now there were at least 50 people on site every day. Researchers, production staff, an army of young diggers, reenactors, several camera crew, all of whom were as much part of Time Team as those on screen. The 3 days that we had together were always special. We worked hard, but then there was a party atmosphere which usually involved lots of late night drinking, and even though most of the team were terrified of Tim Taylor, he made a point of joining in and brought out his battered guitar and played till dawn while the diggers sung along to his renditions of Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan. But it wasn't only the parties and booze that held us together. 3 days of digging for 10 hours a day under constant scrutiny were made bearable by a constant stream of practical jokes. In the early days, they'd be fairly straightforward. One misty morning, I clambered into a freezing river on the Somerset level to retrieve the fish traps we'd woven out of willow to demonstrate how peasants in the early Middle Ages got their protein. But when I pulled them to the surface and presented them to the camera, someone had filled them with tins of salmon and small jars of pickled mussels. As time went by, the pranks became more complex. Our sound man, Steve Bowen, is famous for falling into a deep sleep after 5 or 6 drinks, and one night he collapsed in a bar and couldn't be woken. So the younger archaeologist bound him from head to toe in camera tape, painted him blue, covered his face in makeup and lipstick, and wrote tasteless phrases in eyeliner on his cheeks and forehead. He now looked like an Egyptian mummy decorated by Tracy Emin. Then they scrubbed him up again and dumped him in an empty hotel room. The next morning he'd have no idea where he was, what had happened to him, at least not until he found the incriminating Polaroids scattered all over his duvet. These jokes grew into full-scale works of art. I had a white Range Rover, which was particularly handy when we were working off-road. On a shoot in the Lake District, I drove it 2/3 of the way up a small mountain on the slithery dirt track till I got our forward camp, locked it and left it for the day, and jumped off to film the excavation of a Roman copper mine. When I got back at 6 that evening, a police car was parked there with its blue light flashing, but there was no policeman about, and my Range Rover had disappeared. I wandered anxiously around the surrounding hillside, but I couldn't find it anywhere. When I returned 20 minutes later, a few archaeologists were sitting around drinking from their thermos flasks before starting the long trudge homewards. "Have you seen my motor?" I said, but they hadn't. "You should ask the coppers," someone suggested. "See if their car's open, and if you beep the horn, that should get them back, shouldn't it?" "I'm not sure I'm allowed to." I approached it apprehensively. On the passenger seat there were lots of items which seemed familiar. Something that looked like my wet weather gear, my North Face jacket, my books, my dried mango slices. Shitty McShit. How could I possibly have been such an idiot? It wasn't a police car at all. It was my Range Rover, meticulously disguised with coloured camera tape, specially printed police logos and false number plates bearing the registration number of TT1FU. As for the blue lamp, it was the original one from the Doctor Who TARDIS, which had been borrowed from the props department at BBC Cardiff. See, I loved the little stories like that. Him talking about, behind the scenes and making his documentaries, how hard it is, what it was like to direct plays, to produce plays. His stories, like one time he had to walk through the stalls but naked, and he had to go around the back of the theatre and everything, take off his dressing gown and then go through the door. He took off his dressing gown, the person who took it off had run back only to find that the door wasn't open, so he then had to walk back naked all the way around the streets, through the lobby and everything. Embarrassing stories like that. I loved him talking about working with children, writing for children, raising his children. I loved his relationship, how he writes about his first wife, Bardi, the mother of his children, Mary, who he was with for 12 years. He was with Bardi, Barbara. They were married for 4 years, and they were together about 6 years. Various other women in his life, and he doesn't talk about Louise until the epilogue. She's literally on the epilogue's only 2 pages long, and one of those is covered in the funerals, as discussed. And she's mentioned in the prologue as well, because they're talking about him being knighted. So she's on a couple of pages of his autobiography, but I do like that he doesn't write about her. Even though he is he openly talks about his various relationships with Bardi and Mary and such. He never talks badly about them. He talks about how their relationships broke down and everything, but he never talks badly about them. And I like how with Louise, he's keeping his relationship with her private. He doesn't have to talk about her if he doesn't want to, and he chooses not to, and I really respect him for that. Because some celebrities, they like to talk about a lot about their current relationships or marriages, whether they've been for many years or only recently, as with Tony when he wrote this. They married in 2013 and this was 2016, so it was only 3 years into their marriage. But he chooses not to. He chooses to be private about it, and I really respect him for that. I definitely recommend this book. I especially loved hearing him talk about his childhood, him dealing with school when he didn't want to be there, his early career. I loved his story about meeting Judy Garland and having issues with Liza Minnelli. And I really enjoyed all of the stories and everything, and especially talking about things like Blackadder and that, which I've first introduced me to Tony, but I especially love his passion when he's talking about archaeology, history and such, and all the documentaries that he made, because they were my favourite things that Tony's been involved in, and I love them to this day, and reading his perspective on those was wonderful. I definitely recommend this. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really want to get hold of the audiobook, as I said, to hear his words said by him and feel his autobiography on a completely different level than just reading the words. Tony, thank you for writing this. I absolutely love this. I'll cherish this. I've actually got a signed copy. So, because even though I went to see the session about this, I had to run off. I couldn't stay for the signing, so I couldn't get a personalised copy. But luckily, he signed a load after he was done with the signing, which they were selling in the shop, and I managed to get hold of a signed copy. So thank you, Tony, for writing this book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I can't wait to read more of your books. All right, and guys, that's what I thought on Tony Robinson's No Cunning Plan, My Story. If you read this book, I'd love to know what you think. You can leave a comment in the comments box below, or give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Entirely up to you. I'll let you decide. And I'll be back shortly announcing which book I'll be reading next, which will be fiction. All right, guys, bye.